The problem with the Nicolaitans is twofold. They eat meat sacrificed to other deities, big no-no according to the author of Revelation, and they are also associated with sexual immorality, and the Greek word here is porneia. And the Nicolaitans reappear for the first time in a very important document called the Syntagma. Now, the Syntagma is the very first heresy catalog. It is the blacklist that is the mother of all blacklists. Of course, in Jesus' teaching, if you divorce your wife, you cause her to commit adultery. So Nicholas is effectively causing his wife to have adultery with who? The other apostles.
Welcome to the Patreon of M. David Litwa. I'm Gnostic Informant, and you are about to attain true gnosis. And available now on Amazon is Found Christianities. And here is the author who is with me right now, and he's here to talk about that.
All right, yeah. So here's the book. It's hot off the press, and in this series, I'm going to be talking about all the chapters, and most of these chapters are going to be exclusively, that is, the series is going to be exclusively available on this Patreon site. So stay tuned for more videos. Today, this is part 4. We'll be looking at that mysterious group called the Nicolaitans. The Nicolaitans are a very mysterious early Christian group. The Nicolaitans are very mysterious, but also very important. And I'm going to have my take on this. There's going to be other takes, and this is something really just to whet your appetite and to learn more about. The take that I have is basically a mythicist take on it. And you'll see what I mean as we go on. We're going to talk about the sources. We're going to talk about what we can and cannot trust. And we're going to talk about what we can and cannot know about this early Christian group that is associated with Gnostics and Gnostic Christianity. So, the Nicolaitans are first mentioned in, lo and behold, the book of Revelation. And in this book, it starts out with a series of 7 letters, which go to 7 Greek cities in Asia Minor. That's Western Turkey here. Ephesus and Pergamum, those 2 letters have mention of a group called Nicolaitans. And in these letters, which are supposedly dictated by Christ himself, he says that he hates the works of the Nicolaitans. That's in the letter to the Ephesians. And then later on, we learn that the Nicolaitans have a teaching that is associated with the doctrine of Balaam, Balaam being this Old Testament prophet
With the donkey.
in the book of Numbers, most famous for having a talking ass, which doesn't refer to his backside, but his donkey. And here we learn that the problem with the Nicolaitans is twofold. That is, they eat meat sacrificed to other deities, okay? Big no-no, according to the author of Revelation. And they are also associated with sexual immorality. And the Greek word here is porneia, okay? Whence English porn, but porneia mainly refers to prostitution. And then Christians used it, expanded the meaning to being basically any kinds of sexual practice they didn't like. So those are the two charges of Nicolaitans. They've got a doctrine and they've got these two practices. And that's it. That's all that we know about this group. Fast forward about 70 years, 75 years, maybe 80 years, and the Nicolaitans reappear for the first time in a very important document called the Syntagma. Now, the Syntagma is the very first heresy catalog. It is the blacklist that is the mother of all blacklists. And it is mentioned by Justin Martyr, who probably wrote the initial version of it about 145. But in that initial version, he didn't mention the Nicolaitans. But in a later editor adds, we think, a section of text on the Nicolaitans and begins for the very first time to associate the Nicolaitans with a fellow by the name of Nicholas in Acts. And this is the very first time we get this association made, okay? Irenaeus, who basically copies out this updated version of the Syntagma into his own heresy catalog, well known as Against Heresies, he later makes the comment that the Nicolaitans were a branch of the quote-unquote Gnostics. This, interestingly, would make Nicholas a contender with Simon of Samaria for the title of the first Gnostic. And this is why this is a little bit confusing for many people, who was actually the first. Now, in a previous session, which is in Gnostic Informant, we looked at Simon of Samaria, so go check out that video.
Thank you.
Here, we go to the next source that we have, and that is a guy by the name of Clement of Alexandria. Clement, obviously here in Egypt, late 2nd century. He's got this really fascinating story that he tells, that he claims he learned from other people, possibly in Alexandria, possibly somewhere else. But according to this story, really juicy tidbit, Nicholas was actually a righteous guy, as he's depicted in Acts, because Nicholas is the first deacon and is or part of the first team of deacons, and so he better be good. So Nicholas had issues with his wife because he got very jealous of her. So one day he sets her up before all the other apostles, puts her in the middle of the room, and basically offers the other apostles and says, hey, anyone who wants to take her as wife, go ahead.
Wow.
And as Clement is trying to make the point that Nicholas is not this sexually immoral person, but in order to get this point across, he tells a story which ends up making Nicholas look a little bit, shall we say, weird.
Yeah.
Because, of course, in Jesus's teaching, if you divorce your wife, you cause her to commit adultery. So Nicholas is effectively causing his wife to have adultery with who? The other apostles. So this is this is an interesting turn of events.
Yeah.
Clement then makes the case that, okay, so this happened with Nicholas, who was actually, his wife was very beautiful, but he offered her, some might say prostituted her, but he offered her as wife to other people, so he's very chaste, right? It's actually then the followers of Nicholas, according to Clement, that become these sexual profligates and these wild people who get into all sorts of orgies and whatnot. Finally, the next big portrait of the Nicolaitans appears in the late 4th century on the island of Cyprus. And this account comes from the pen of that very wily bishop, Epiphanius. Epiphanius, dependent on Irenaeus, says that he is the only one who gives us the actual account of Nicolaitan doctrine. Now get this. This is the first time we actually have the content of Nicolaitan teaching, and guess what? It ends up being a version of the Gnostic myth, which is 300 years after Nicolaitans are supposed to have lived. Okay, this is the first time we hear about this. Okay. And Epiphanius adds some really interesting tidbits that Nicolaitans are the first ones to start this famous Christian ritual where men and women gather together for a meal, some kind of Eucharistic meal. They, in the course of this meal, strip down naked, have random sex with each other, and the men ejaculate, and the women use their monthly menses.
Wow.
And in this ritual, they offer their seminal fluids to God. And in terms of the way that they offer them is that they eat their own semen and eat their own menses in a secret ritual. Amazing. This is Epiphanius. It's exactly like vintage Epiphanius. The wildest, craziest things that he can fling at you, they are flung at you. You heard it here first in Epiphanius. Why did you hear it here first in Epiphanius? Because he made it up.
Right. I think it's pretty obvious.
So then we're left with this issue with the Nicolaitans. So after we kind of do the hard work of laying out, okay, so what are the sources of the Nicolaitans? What can we know? What can't we know? Who says what and when and where? Here's what we got. There is no strong evidence that Nicolaitans were ever a coherent group in the late 1st and early 2nd century. Okay. What we have is a practice of labeling. This is very common even today among Christians, where they'll say that, oh, well, you people are X. Okay, so you know, the original Calvinists, they didn't call themselves Calvinists, right? But they got named Calvinists by the enemies of John Calvin, okay? And eventually the name kind of stuck. In this case, the author of Revelation is using a name for a group that we know nothing else about, except that they participated in Greco-Roman banquets and festivities in Ephesus and Pergamum. That is, they ate meat which was in celebration of other deities, and they didn't have a problem with it. Okay, so that shows us what Christians were doing in the late 1st century. And they had some kind of teaching, which the author of Revelation says nothing about in terms of content, okay? But they had some kind of teaching that he was not at all happy about. Later heresiologists then discovered a founder of the Nicolaitans in the book of Acts, which I think is fairly late, mid-2nd century. And they later then fused, and one might argue confused, these Nicolaitans with Gnostics.
Wow.
Who, you know, a vague Gnostic theology, which was imported and became Nicolaitan doctrine. Okay. And so what this shows us is this is a sort of exercise in the heresiological imagination, okay? There are some Christian groups, okay, that, and I'm going to stop sharing here, there are some Christian groups that actually existed in the past. But there are other Christian groups that are, if they had some kind of existence, What we know about them, as it's told from the perspective of their enemies, is a bunch of fictional puzzle pieces that they are connecting and reconnecting hundreds of years after these people supposedly live. As far as I'm concerned as a scholar, and others, we're going to have different views on this one, okay? People are going to disagree. Feel free to study this yourself. Disagree with me, totally fine. But what I think is most revealing about the Nicolaitans is it shows us that they are chiefly a product of the heresiological imagination.
Wow.
They are actually a mythicized Christian group that later becomes one of the roots of Gnostic Christian theology, a theology that didn't originate with them, but was imported into their system hundreds of years after they supposedly existed. All that we know about this group is really what the author of Revelation tells us. And that's all, folks.
Yeah, and that's interesting. So there's nothing mentioned about Nicolaitans before Revelation, if I'm not mistaken.
Exactly.
So
First time we hear of them.
so when do you think Revelation was written, in your own opinion? I know different scholars have different dates, but what do you think? I just want to get your opinion.
So I'm not in any way unique here. I think it's late first century, probably 90s.
Yeah.
And
Do you think
yeah,
it's
some people
before?
would put it in the 60s, but I think that's based on
Do you
some
think?
some slightly wishful thinking about who this author is,
Yeah.
as if he's like the real John some
I was
time
gonna
ago.
say, do you think it's the same author who wrote John at least, or if it's someone else, or no?
No, in fact, for all of critical scholarship, this author of the Book of Revelation, who calls himself John, more or less everybody agrees he writes completely differently
Yeah,
than the author of the so-called Gospel of John and the Epistles of John. So it's a
I agree.
totally different dude, and we're all pretty much agreed on
Yeah,
that.
I just wanted to point that out too. And so then you got these Nicolaitans and not mentioned at all. Then they're sort of mentioned in Revelation. And then when was it that you said that these like real horrible things are being said about them? You said it's like 100 years later. What did you say it was? Second century?
So they reappear in the Syntagma, and not in the first edition, in one of the second or later editions, so around 170, 175.
Wow. So that
So
is
we're talking about at least a 70-year gap between Revelation and then the heresiological portrait of the Nicolaitans.
that's fascinating. And the last thing I wanted to touch on was you mentioned how they're being described as eating meat sacrificed to idols and not caring. Now that's fast. That's the thing that stands out to me about that is when you read Paul in Romans, Paul is telling the reader to not care about if you hey you might go to a party or and you might eat some meat sacrificed to idols. Just don't ask and don't care. It's basically what he's telling them. So it's funny to me how they're calling that heresy when Paul himself is the one who is saying that it's okay. Now I wonder
Yeah.
what you think about that.
So absolutely. So this seems to be the classic Pauline position that a Greco-Roman deity is in fact not a threat. But Paul himself is, as usual, a little bit confusing because in 1 Corinthians 8, he seems to say, Greco-Roman deities, they're nothing. You can eat whatever you want. So what if it's sacrificed to a Greco-Roman deity? An idol is nothing in his language. And then a couple chapters later, 1 Corinthians 10, he's like, but actually, these might be daimones in disguise, or as is said today, demons in disguise. And I don't want you to have fellowship with demons. I interpret this as the directions that he gives is that if you go to a private home and there's a sort of don't ask, don't tell policy that, they're serving meat, you don't have to raise your hand and say, hey, where did this come from? You should only stop eating the meat if the host specifically looks at you and says, hey, guess what? I sacrificed this to Apollo. Enjoy. So that's the only thing that's his only rule. And Paul also seems to be uncomfortable with people going to actual temples. But besides that, he doesn't seem to have a problem with eating meat. Justin Martyr, interestingly, 100 years later, says that he knew plenty of Christians who were eating meat sacrificed to idols. It was the best meat in town. They had no problem with it. They're taking a Pauline position. And it turns out that more conservative Christians who just don't want to accommodate in any single way with Greco-Roman culture, good example being the author of Revelation, they just have a stricter view and they condemn their fellow Christians for not being strict enough.
Wow. It's just fascinating to think about the political stuff that's happening back then within these Christian groups. And yeah, you just did a great job of describing some of this stuff, especially with the Nicolaitans. I guess since I just thought of this too, the Nicolaitans being described as the Gnostics, and not even, and more in particular, Nicholas being described as the first Gnostic. What do you think about that? Do you think that it's actually Simon Magus, or do you agree with this version?
Well, I don't agree with any of
Okay.
those versions. I think that Simon, and this is in a previous a presentation, I think that Simon is just his own theologian,
Right.
and that we as scholars in the 21st century probably should not call that Gnostic. He's just doing his own early Christian experimental theology, and it's his own, and it's interesting, and we have access to it in the Great Declaration Commentary. Nicholas is just completely made up. He's appears to be just a fictional character. The
Interesting.
author of Acts says that he's from Antioch, that he was a proselyte from Antioch, that he came to Jerusalem and became one of the first 6 deacons. That's all that he says. And then all this later mythology of him being the group of, leader of a group that commits these horrible
Right.
orgies and semen eating, menses eating, mass movement of sexual profligates, and that he basically sells his wife into prostitution. That's all fun fictionalizing. That's stuff for that mythicists can sink their teeth into, because there you go, it's Christian mythicizing in the making. None of that has any, in my opinion, is in any way close to being historically true, and that's where we are.
Yeah, and so the last thing I want to touch on real quick is you mentioned that they had their own different. I think you said creation myth or Gnostic myth or something like that. I think you said that, one of those two. How is that different than the other Gnostic? I think you have Justin the Gnostic, and then you have this version of sort of the how the world came about. And I think one of them says is the demiurge, and then I think, is there another one that says that Sophia creates the world? Do you know anything about that or no?
Well, all of this, yes, I talk about in the book. Unfortunately, it has nothing to do with Nicolaitans, because they
Okay.
don't have it's Epiphanius way late in the 4th century
Right, right.
who gives them a Gnostic who gives them
That's
a,
what I
a
was thinking of.
Gnostic creation account. And basically, it appears to be something that he kind of cobbled together in his own imagination from other sources, and then just put back into his report on the Nicolaitans. And this is classic Epiphanius, mixing and matching and not caring too much about history. So
Okay.
you have to be careful when you're reading heresiologists. In fact, I should really get busy and just do an episode on introducing all the heresiologists and telling them who you are. I do a little bit about that in the intro to Found Christianities. So you can get all the basic information there.
Awesome. And yeah, that pretty much answers all the questions that I had. And is there anything else you want to say? And I know before, while we're still on the topic, the Patreon is up. The book is available on Amazon. Found Christianities. Also, patreon.com/mdavidlitwa.
Yep. And so this is, again, chapter 4 in the book. And so for all my facts and data, you can go check that out and get the paperback. And yeah, go to town, critique me, feel free, come up with your own theory, but join the conversation.
There it is. And you have just attained true gnosis.